Hello and welcome to Where the Bush is Burning. I'm your host, Tom Tice, and each week we gather together to have a conversation about Christ. I appreciate all of you who have been watching, and it's good to hear from those of you who have commented, and I appreciate that, and appreciate your being involved with what we're doing here at Where the Bush is Burning and the support. So I appreciate all of you and thank you for joining us once again for another conversation about Christ. Now, last week we talked about Christ's advice to the people with regard to the Pharisees. And for the sake of those of you who perhaps haven't seen that, the Pharisees were the religious teachers in the nation of Israel. Their influence was broad. It was very grassroots. They taught in the synagogues. They held a lot of control over the people with regard to morals and ethics and behavior. They taught the law of Moses, and so consequently they had an astronomical amount of influence in the nation of Israel. They had very strong opinions about themselves, and they had very strong opinions about others, had very strong opinions about what people did, and so consequently, Christ, when he began to carry out his public ministry, ruffled a lot of their feathers. He did things of which they frankly did not approve, and they were, for the longest time, some of his major opponents. Now, the Sadducees that we talked about a little bit last week ran the temple. They were the high priests. They were the ones who had the money and were making basically money off of religion. So that was the Sadducees. Pharisees, much more involved in grassroots influence. They were the people who lived very much by certain rules and regulations. They taught the law of Moses and gave the interpretation of the law and all of the practical applications. So when Christ came along, he, of course, being a construction worker and a person who had not grown up in the rabbinical schools, they looked at him rather dimly to begin with. They took a very relatively negative view of him right from the outset. Now, early on in the piece, Christ, as he began to preach and as he began to do miracles, and as he began to called his disciples from among the common folk. So Peter, James, John, they were fishermen. There were other people. There was one called Simon the Zealot. He was a political activist, if you want to call him that. He very strongly opposed Rome and Roman rule. And then there were others, one of whom was Matthew. Now, Matthew was a publican. He was a tax collector for the empire. And so, because he was Jewish and because he worked for the Romans, and in that particular context did not actually receive payment as such from the Romans, but was expected to charge a certain amount of money more and would then keep the difference for himself. Tax collectors were very, very powerfully hated in the Jewish community because they were themselves Jews working for the occupying force of Rome. Now then, in the passage of Scripture I'm going to read to you, Christ picks Matthew, or he's also sometimes referred to as Levi, out of the crowd in the sense that he is in his custom booth and Christ stops and Christ addresses him directly. And when he does, this is what happens. In chapter 9 and verse 9 of Matthew, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." So he arose and followed him. Now it happened as Jesus sat at the table in the house that, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and sat down with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard that, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Now, this was the thin end of the wedge, if you want to call it that. This was just the beginning of his ministry. This was when he was calling his disciples to him. It would be years later when ultimately he would say the things that he said that we talked about last week, where he gave certain advice about the Pharisees and how to treat them or how to behave and what attitude to have towards them. So realize this is the front end of the ministry. Later on, he did eventually enter into, for all intents and purposes, open conflict with the Pharisees. Now, during this particular period of time, in the early parts of his ministry, they began to find fault with him in various ways. For example, if we go on a little past just where we were reading, the disciples of John came to him saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast?" And then Christ answers them and goes on. And we're not going to get into that part of it. But understand, the Pharisees fasted often, and they took offense to the fact that Christ and his disciples were not doing as they did. Now then, later on, in this same general area of the Gospel of Matthew, there are other things that happen. For example, Christ begins to speak about people and their unbelief. And he says about John, who was his predecessor, John the Baptist, "For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is justified by her children." So he's referring to how the Pharisees viewed his relationship with these common people, the publicans and the sinners, the people who were really the spiritually needy people. They were, as Mark refers to them, the common people who heard him gladly. And so there was this rising tide of opposition by these people who were the Pharisees to Jesus himself, because of the fact that he was associating himself with these people who they considered to be low, common tax collectors, sinners, breakers of the law of God, people who didn't uphold the same moral and ethical standards that the Pharisees claimed to themselves uphold. And so as he did things, they would oppose him more. And for example, he healed a man on the Sabbath day in the synagogue, and he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out. It was restored as whole as the other. Then the Pharisees went out and plotted against him, how they might destroy him. So he generated a lot of hatred from these people early on in the piece. The people who were like Matthew, the tax collectors, the sinners, the people who were not the followers of the law in the manner in which the Pharisees were. These were the people to whom Christ appealed. These were the people who heard him gladly. These were the people who followed him here and there and heard him speak. These were the people among whom he did these great miracles that he did, which were things that were hard to gainsay. The Pharisees had difficulty trying to successfully oppose him because, in fact, he was doing mighty works among the people. Now, later on, he would feed 5,000 men plus women and children with 5 loaves and 2 fish. He would raise Jairus' daughter from the dead. He would raise the son of the widow of Nain from the dead. He would eventually, later on in the piece, raise Lazarus from the dead. All of these wonderful works that he did for all intents and purposes in the midst of the common people. And they were the people to whom Christ came. He came, as he said, to seek and to save that which was lost. So Christ did not aspire to wealth. He went about not having any place to live. He said, the foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests. The Son of Man does not have any place to lay his head. He was itinerant. He was, for all intents and purposes, homeless. And he lived among the common people as a common person. The Pharisees and the Sadducees could not abide this, because they were already sure that they were of necessity much better than these people with whom Christ associated. They called him the friend of publicans and sinners. They took umbrage at the fact that he would sit down with them and eat with them. He would receive them. He would go into their houses. He would heal them. He would walk with them. He would talk with them. And so this generated a lot of animosity from the Pharisees. And yet these were the people from whom, in human terms, Christ came. He did not come from a highborn household, although his mother was of the house and lineage of David, so she was of that kingly and royal household. But she was not herself a wealthy woman. She was not herself a woman of much means necessarily. Her husband Joseph was a carpenter, so he was of the ordinary folk who went out and worked for a living. It was to these people that Christ came. It was with these people that Christ associated himself. It was in the midst of these people that he carried out his greatest works. He constantly sought out the people who were marginalized, the people who were out of the way, the people who were not the high and the mighty, not the religious leaders, not those who were politically influential, not those who were certainly well off because they had made a great deal of money on religion. These were not the people with whom he primarily associated. The people with whom he primarily associated were the common, ordinary people, and they were the people who saw his wonderful works. They heard the wonderful words that proceeded out of his mouth. They received the benefit of many of the miracles that he did, not the least of which was, of course, the feeding of the 5,000. And they were the people who ultimately were his most hospitable audience. Now, here is a good thing for us to consider. God does not see status in the manner in which human beings see it. Paul would later go on and say that God did not call the high, did not call the mighty. He called the low. He called the poor. He called the people who were not by worldly consideration the impressive or the well-off, that he called the regular, ordinary people. And so, having said that, we find here that Christ in his life demonstrated a very egalitarian, a very inclusive, a very hospitable sort of relationship with the regular, ordinary people in the community. And that's good for us to recognize. We sometimes are wrongly impressed by certain statuses. We are perhaps more impressed with wealth than we should be. We are perhaps more impressed with people with very long titles and people with very high official positions, regardless of what field in which they happen to be operating. And so if we look at Christ and have a conversation about Christ, we see that he gave himself to the ordinary people, gave himself to the common people who heard him gladly. And we should not despise the ordinary, regular people. The vast majority of us are very much that way. We go out to work. We work our days through the week. We try to save a little money if we can. We have to live. We live modestly. Money gets tight from time to time. We are the we are the common people in many respects of our day. And we ought to understand that in the imitation of Christ, we should look at others in the manner in which he did. He was not a person who was what we would call a respecter of persons, in the sense that he did not look at people on the basis of their wealth or on the basis of their title, on the basis of the office or the position. He looked at people who were the common and the ordinary folk, and those were the people to whom he primarily dedicated himself. So that's a good thing for us to know about Christ. It's a good conversation for us to have about Christ, and I trust that it is useful to you today, and that you consider how Christ viewed other people. Very warm and welcoming to a group of people that other people would have despised. Yet he loved them and gave himself for them, and gave himself for a great multitude, which no man can number. So that's our conversation for today. I hope that it's useful to you. I hope that you find that it's profitable. If you enjoy what we're doing, like and subscribe, please. If you would like to receive the devotional, you can get it through hopeharbor.church. That's hopeharbor.church. Or you can get it on Substack, where it's listed as Where the Bush is Burning. Substack will come in your email every day, and so you can do it that way. Once a week, we put up an audio message from Hope Harbor as well, and we'd like for you to listen to that if that suits your purpose and will be helpful to you. Thank you once again for joining us here at Where the Bush is Burning. Once again, I'm your host, Tom Tice. Do please tune in another week if it suits your purpose and if it works well for you. Thank you. We appreciate you being a part of what we're doing here at Where the Bush is Burning.